I recently saw an article from Reuters titled "Gender Bias is Not Improved Over Past Decade," UN says. And the fact that Reuters is reporting on this is very important because lots of other media outlets basically take their news from Reuters. And so that's why you'll notice, if you read the Reuters coverage, lots of phrases crop up in the Reuters coverage that also crop up in the subsequent articles from other outlets, because, of course, journalists are not known, mainstream journalists are not known for their integrity, their creativity. But it's important because this sets the agenda for the news in a certain sense. So they're always a good outlet to pay attention to. And I'm going to read a little bit from it, but not very much. And then I'm going to look at the actual report itself, break it down, say why it's insane, use poor research methods because, of course, I specialised in research methodology. I've got a master's in it. And so this is pretty low-hanging fruit for me, to be honest.
It's your wheelhouse.
It is indeed. Yeah. So the article says, the survey draws from data sets spanning 2010 to 2014 and 2017 to 2022. And so it is meant to be roughly a 10-year span from countries and territories covering 85% of the global population. And it says, despite a surge in women's rights groups and social movements like Time's Up and Me Too in the United States, biosocial norms and broader human development crisis heightened by COVID-19, when many women lost their income, have stalled progress on inequality. And this is a misrepresentation because they deliberately cite the United States. And I've looked at the data that they collected both in 2020, which is a different one, but the same methodology, and the one that was published recently. And they actually found that biases reduced by about 4% in 2020. And I'm going to break down why these biases are nonsense. But just for the time being, I'm going to talk about it in their own terms before saying it's silly. But yes, it showed that actually it decreased, so it's not exactly stagnant. If anything, you could say perhaps there's even an inverse relationship, that women losing their jobs reduced gender biases. I mean, based on that data, they're making the conclusions about it. I would say there's not enough quality data there to make any conclusions about these things, but they're the ones doing it. And if you're doing so, you could even argue that taking women out of the workplace seem to have reduced inequality according to their. I don't actually believe that to be true.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see in Scandinavia, like places like Sweden and that, where men and women become more equal, if you want, but what it actually means is more similar, in terms of their function in society. You find that sexism actually increases, and actually when they're more differentiated, it decreases, and actually more importantly, happiness goes up.
Yeah. I heard that from the very good Dr. Peterson.
As did I.
Funny that. But yes, Al Jazeera as well also reported on it, which I thought was quite funny because it's, of course, an Islamic State media outlet. And so I find the notion of them covering this as if it's some sort of problem kind of amusing. But that aside, the elephant in the room, which you probably haven't noticed, is that, well, they keep using this word woman, but what is it? Well,
that's a great question.
John Tangney has the answer, hopefully, in his article. He's a very good writer. I really like what he has to say. He's always got something interesting to say and original. And here is his article, Pride Month and What is a Woman? And I hope that he finally manages to answer that very difficult question that I just can't get my head around. It's so hard to define.
Epoch-defining question.
But yes, definitely check that out. It's on the website. You have to become a member to read it, but you also get an audio track from our very own Jonathan Crowe, who is a silver-tongued devil.
Oh, yes.
If ever I heard one.
Yes, he's very talented.
But yes, make sure to check that out. And you can then proceed with the segment because, of course, you'll know what a woman is. But here's the report itself, or at least the UN page talking about it. A decade of stagnation. UNDP data shows gender biases remain entrenched. And I'm going to read this and break it down because it's a bit nuts. And I think it kind of needs a data analyst's eye as well as someone who's been covering this for a long time to pick out the actual intricacies of where it goes wrong. So it says, the latest Gender Social Norm Index, GSNI, report has revealed no improvement in biases against women in a decade, with almost 9 out of 10 men and women worldwide still holding biases today. That's not how it's reported in the mainstream media, though. It's funny that, isn't it? They're all framing it about men, but they at least acknowledge here that it's men and women, right?
Yes.
So it's almost like you have societal attitudes that both men and women share. And in fact, as we'll get onto later, women tend to be the ones who enforce it more.
Yeah. Furthermore, it's almost as if, it's almost as if there's something beyond like mere social conditioning at play here. It's almost as if there's maybe something intrinsic about these things.
God forbid it be influenced by biology. I mean, that would be terrible, wouldn't it? So it says half of people worldwide still believe men make better political leaders than women, and more than 40% believe men make better business executives than women. A staggering 25% of people believe it is justified for a man to beat his wife, according to the new GSNI report launched today by the United Nations Development Programme, reflecting the latest data from the World Values Survey. So, first and foremost, I'd say I approve of the first two things that they said are somewhat prevalent, in that, you know, there are perfectly good reasons why people might believe men make better political leaders. I think one reason that comes to mind is that to be a political leader, you've got to have solidarity. You've got to put down dissenters, basically. You want to be unified, because then you'll be more effective. And to do that, you have to be quite disagreeable. And that means that men, because they tend to be more disagreeable by disposition, as many big five personality trait inventories have shown. You know, it's a very, very robust effect that this is something that men are good at. And so if someone is aware of that, I mean, it's not too beyond the realm of reason that people can figure that out for themselves. You don't need academic research. It's kind of common sense to understand this. Now,
again, from Peterson, I am I'm aware of the Big Five model, and I recognise it's kind of considered the most reliable personality model out there. Is that right?
It's the most widely used.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that there are other ones as well.
Yeah.
And I think that taking a bit more of a holistic look at it is normally better, because by trying to reduce things into categories, it is inherently reductionistic.
Yeah.
And so you lose some of the nuance there.
Yeah.
And I'm all about the detail.
Yeah. But I mean, nevertheless, you know, as you say, it's not sexist to observe that, statistically speaking, on average, women are more agreeable than men. And actually, that's not a bad thing either.
Well, no,
where does the maternal impulse come from otherwise?
Yeah, and there are so many good things that we're going to talk about. Like, agreeable people tend to be perceived as warm and friendly.
Yeah.
They work better in teams. They have a better understanding of emotions of others, better at resolving conflict civilly, tend to be more altruistic and less aggressive.
Yeah.
These are all really good traits.
Excellent social traits, but not social traits that select for business leaders and political leaders.
Yeah, you ideally want someone who perhaps isn't like that, because if they're quite warm and friendly and altruistic and you're running a really stressful business, I mean, it depends on the business. Sometimes a warm and friendly person would be suited to it. So that's, again, somewhere where the detail is key.
Sure.
What industries, what kind of thing. If it's like finance, something kind of quite male-brained as an industry, where, you know, systematic thinking, which men excel at, would lend itself well to, then it might make sense that there are more men there.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of nuance there that is missing in the questions here that they're asking. Obviously, I don't approve of men beating their wives.
No.
I think that it's actually a sign of being a weak man.
Oh, yeah.
And that if you can't resolve things civilly, it's a sign that you've failed.
Yeah, well, I mean, losing your temper in that way is the most unmasculine thing imaginable.
Well, yes. We're going to talk about, basically, men's complementary role towards women, and the main pillar of masculinity, the one that's most exclusively male, is the protect.
Yes.
And you're very much failing in protecting women and children if you're hitting them.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious, really.
Yeah.
And that's why it's always been abhorrent. And I'll never forget something my grandmother said to me when we were just talking about kind of attitudes back in the day. And she said, oh, if your granddad hit me, I would hit him back.
Yeah.
And she grew up like in World War II, the time when supposedly gender roles were so stratified and evil and terrible. And they were oppressing women.
Yeah.
And it's funny that, you know, you actually speak to someone of the time and they have a very different thing to say.
Yeah.
Like, actually, men of the time frowned at other men hitting their wives. They saw it as weak, as we do.
Yeah.
Right? And it is weak. And
it is, yeah.
And so, yes, there is a part of this report that I kind of agree with is bad. But some of it, I think, misses some of the detail that you need to understand the world. It's simplified to a fault, I would say. So it carries on to say, the report argues that these biases drive hurdles faced by women manifested in a dismantling of women's rights in many parts of the world, with movements against gender equality gaining traction. But wait a minute, didn't you say it's stagnated, that gender bias has stayed the same? So how, you kind of want your cake and eat it too. In that you're saying that things are getting worse in terms of, you know, women's situation in the world, and yet you're saying that all of these biases are remaining stagnant. So doesn't that suggest that these attitudes perhaps are separate from the measures that you're saying women's rights are changing, if that is true at all, which I am not sure it is, to be honest.
No, indeed.
And it carries on to say, biases are also reflected in the severe underrepresentation of women in leadership. Oh, this is ridiculous, isn't it? On average, I mean, imagine if they did a poll just asking women whether they desired leadership roles against men.
Yeah.
And we would probably see a very big difference.
Yeah.
I'm sure that literature probably already exists.
Oh, no doubt, yeah.
Believe it or not, I've not read all of the scientific literature in existence yet. One day.
Yeah.
But it carries on to say, on average, the share of women as heads of state or heads of government has remained around 10% since 1995. And in the labour market, women occupy less than a third of managerial positions. The report also sheds light on a broken link between women's progress in education, economic empowerment.
Sorry, I really hate this framing because it is just, these people who wrote this would probably describe themselves as left-wing or liberal.
Undoubtedly, if you work for the UN, it's kind of a prerequisite.
In some capacity. But it's just so funny how their metric for success and their understanding of the good life is being, a corporate drone. John, would you mind just scrolling up just a little? Because there was a phrase there. Economic empowerment, as if the mere number in your bank account is what constitutes success as a woman. Like, I think that's actually a sexist attitude, right?
Well, I think it's also wrong for men as well.
Well, it's wrong for both sexes, but I think at the very least, the male brain can be predisposed to just generate as much money as possible at all costs, like work an 80-hour week, and pull all-nighters and so on. But actually,
it's not healthy.
It's not healthy, and actually, there are men who find that fulfilling. I wouldn't find that fulfilling. But actually, I don't think that, as I say, I don't think most people would find that fulfilling. And, I don't think women in particular would, because that's just not, again, we were talking about the kind of predisposition towards warmth and, nurture and so on. That's not going to, I don't think somebody like that is going to be fulfilled by just, a kind of
being a ruthless careerist and striving to be basically the top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
That seems counter to those principles. And I don't think they're making a mistake in not pursuing it, to be honest.
No, of course
I mean, as Peterson says, I'm quoting from him quite heavily today, it seems. It's a very, very select few number of men that make those positions. So it's more interesting to ask, what is it about those men that make them inclined to do that in the first place? Because that's not for me.
No.
I would hate to be a prime minister, for example. Under no circumstances would I want to do that.
Yeah. But again, just this managerial view of success, where it is purely, what can be expressed in a statistic.
Have you picked up on the lie of omission here?
Go on.
So notice how they talk about the economy and labour markets in terms of leadership positions. They don't talk about rates of employment. They don't talk about salaries.
No, yeah.
In university and education, they don't talk about the fact that Western countries now have more women than men in attendance at university.
Yes, that's true.
To quite a degree. I mean, I did study psychology, so my experiences are probably a bit biased because it was 85% women.
Wow.
Yeah. There was no ulterior motive, I promise. I was just interested in psychology.
Yeah, no, it's the same thing. My university was female dominated, and there were occasions where I studied politics, but there were occasions where I was in seminars where I was the only man in the room.
I remember this is kind of one of my sort of wake up calls to the evils of feminism. I chose to do a criminology module, and I was the only man in the room of 30 women. Even the lecturer was a woman, and there was a woman talking about how misogyny is behind lots of crime, and I kind of pointed out the fact that I'm the only man in the room in a higher education institution. Do you really believe that misogyny is still going on? Like, look at the makeup of this room. No one's deliberately selected the people.
No.
It just so happens that it's all full of women. Of course, they're naturally inclined to be interested in criminology anyway, because of the apparent fascination with serial killers that
So I hear,
is universal, it seems. But I'm going off on a tangent on anecdotes. But anyway, it ends by saying, or at least the part that I'm going to stop reading says, women are more skilled and educated than ever before. So surely that's good, right? By your own terms. And yet, even in 59 countries where women are now more educated than men, so there's an acknowledgement that, just saying, the gender income gap, oh, for goodness sake, remains a staggering 39% in the favour of men. I can't believe they brought that up.
I
Even
know,
the
it's this
EU,
discredited idea.
even the EU discredited this.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is a left-wing sort of almost
Yeah.
socialistic utopian project, and even they're saying this is nuts. Don't
Yeah.
talk about that. So yes, well done UN for outdoing the EU in most annoying supranational organisation.
Yeah, congrats.
So I did mention earlier that there was a similar study in 2020, which is this one, which found the same thing, which is interesting to me. Make of that what you will. I did go in and look at the data, and I did see that there were differences. They're not just reporting the same thing. So it seems like they went out and did record new data for the countries they did sample, and took a bigger sample this time. So it's not that unusual. I think it's just a bit unusual that they found the same percentage.
Yeah.
And so we're going to look a little bit about what their actual methodology was, because figuring out how they can get to these conclusions is a really good way of dismantling their conclusions in the first place, which I think are illogical, irrational, and not based in facts and logic. But let's have a look, shall we, at this next one, which is some of the dimensions. So we're going to have a look at some of the outputs later, which they uploaded in an Excel spreadsheet, and I've screenshotted the countries that I thought were interesting. But these are the sort of statements that they asked participants on a Likert scale, which is like 1 to 7, or some variation thereof.
Yeah,
I
strongly agree, strongly.
Yeah, exactly. And so they have the political ones. Men make better political leaders than women do. Women have the same rights as men. I think those are quite uncontroversial statements to try and get attitudes towards women. Fair enough. And that feeds into the political empowerment index. I hate the term empowerment personally, but there we go. Educational. University is more important for a man than a woman. I mean, there are lots of reasons that someone could believe that without being biased or sexist. For example, you could make the argument that men don't mature as quickly, and therefore going to a university at 18 forces them to mature. And
that was my experience.
Yeah, and mine, to be honest. And so that would be a fair argument where you're not being discriminatory towards women. Actually, you're saying that they've matured more quickly, which is a positive thing. But
this is what this comes down to: is are men and women the same? Yes or no? And now I think no, obviously not, because I have been around men and women my entire life, and you recognise that obviously they are not the same thing, right? And so it's illogical and irrational to treat them the same, right? This is why, and that's not to say that I think that. There would be those that would say that's a sexist remark. But actually, I would say to that, well, okay, if a woman came up to me and smacked me in the face, I actually wouldn't want to give her one back, because that's just wrong for me as a man. Whereas if a man did that, then I wouldn't hesitate. You understand? But equality, this drive towards equality would have me, smack the woman back in the face. And that's just so wrong, right? And so, university is more important for a man than for a woman. Okay, well, if man and woman are two different things, then that may actually be the case.
Well, I think part of treating people well is acknowledging their sort of intricacies, their idiosyncrasies, what makes them who they are, and then treating them accordingly.
Yes.
Like, there are certain things that people have views on whereby, you could do something wrong and it would annoy them and someone else wouldn't mind, and things like that. And so you've got to treat things by a sort of case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
And I also think, on a sort of tangential point, that this sort of value of equality comes from a misunderstanding of English liberalism. It quite often gets accused of being French liberalism, but not to be accused of being a quizzling of the French, but I don't think that's actually the case.
Okay, go on.
Because the English liberal looks at equality before the law, right? And so these sorts of things are kind of couched in that language. Yeah. But equality before the law just means that the government doesn't discriminate against you. Yeah. It was originally couched as like a negative liberty thing, that we do not have the right to discriminate against individuals based on these criteria, which makes sense. But also explicit in the law are laws that protect women in different ways to men.
Yeah.
So,
which I actually think is right.
Well, of course, yeah.
Again, speaking as a conservative, I do think that it's actually kind of right. I was on a Talk TV show the other day, and I said, actually, I don't like this sort of the overbearing kind of sort of more feminine manifestation of protecting women, where it is this kind of again this sort of smothering mother type view of it.
It's a very Jungian archetype, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, very much. But actually, the masculine sort of chivalric traditional sort of way of protecting women, if you want, that's something I'm absolutely in favour of, right?
Yeah. Well, it's clearly a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And
but again, that's sexist, that view. Like, it would be branded.
The funny
as
thing
such.
is, by having the best feedback I've had
Yeah.
in having those attitudes is from women.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I've had women, I've had girlfriends in the past say, being with you makes me feel safe, and that makes me feel comfortable and happier. And they explicitly said it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not taking women at their word, you must be a sexist.
But revealed preference is one of the most powerful things in the world.
Well, the funny thing is that
Gavin
McInnes pointed this out many years ago, that lots of the hardcore sort of feminists, the really belligerent ones, have very kind of masculine boyfriends.
Yeah.
Is that a coincidence?
We have to wonder.
But carrying on to the economic... Oh, sorry, John, if you could go back. It's that the economic ones are: men should have more rights to a job than a woman, and men make better business executives than women do. Obviously, we've addressed the business executives one, but in developing countries where they still have the so-called traditional gender roles, that division of labour makes sense in that you can't pay someone to look after your children like in a Western country. No. You actually have to have someone physically there to look after them and bring them up. And it makes sense for that to be the mother. It doesn't necessarily have to be.
Well, but it's actually preferable.
It is, though, yeah.
Like, as you will no doubt know more than me, psychologically speaking, that is better for the child.
Well, infants form their bonds with a mother more easily because they came from their body.
Yeah, what a surprise, right?
I know, yeah. I mean, it's very intuitive, really, isn't it? And I mean, there's also this sort of conditioning aspect of they're also the one that provides them food, and they're breastfeeding them, ideally. And so... all of these criteria, if you want to like even tame an animal, what you do is you make them feel comfortable and you feed them. Yeah. I mean, we understand it when it's non-human, but I think it's an act of hubris to pretend that we're so different, really.
But again, to bring it back to this, the problem with this managerial view of the world is it does have all human beings as basically being like fungible goods, fungible economic units. You can just replace the mother. It doesn't, the fact that she's the mother doesn't matter. She can just be replaced by an employee, someone you pay to do the same job, and the outcome will be the same. But we obviously recognise that's nonsense, right?
Well, yeah, it separates the sentiments you have towards the people around you, and as someone who kind of had an experience of both, I mean, both my parents were working very professional jobs quite late, but my grandparents also stepped in there. So I had familial figures. Let's try saying that really quickly. But I also sometimes, when they weren't available, had to go into like a care thing. Yeah. And
explains a lot, Josh.
I didn't go there very much. But it was so much more preferable to be with my grandparents because you can also just pick up where you left off. Yeah. And they actually have a vested interest in developing you. Well, some of my best earliest memories are being looked after by my grandparents.
Yeah, but I was going to say there is when you're with family, there is a qualitative investment in you, whereas when you're with some employee, some paid worker, it's a quantitative investment in that they're going to work a set number of hours and be paid paid however much.
And I'm sure and
that's where their interest ends.
I'm sure there are people that do genuinely care.
Oh yeah, of course. But it's never going to be to the same level.
No, of course not. I think having blood ties to a child, your biology kind of kicks in, and you do have this even more protective instinct over them. Yeah. But finally, this is the one that I think is the most egregious. So they've got physical integrity, proxy for intimate partner violence. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Physical integrity, proxy for reproductive rights. Is this a bias against women? I mean, there are a lot of conservative women in America. There are a lot of Islamic women that might argue that this is actually not women's rights whatsoever. No. Actually, it's women's wrongs.
Yes, indeed.
And immoral. And so lumping those together and saying that this is some sort of bias against women is really jumping the gun and missing the nuance of the discussion, really.
But the very fact that that's included in here tells you the type of people that have put this together.
Exactly.
Even using that, I mean, I would never use the phrase reproductive rights. I mean, that comes from a very particular political...
It's also a very dehumanising thing, saying reproductive Like it's putting it in almost cold scientific language.
Yeah.
And although, you know, I've used my fair share of it,
Yeah.
it makes me feel a bit gross when applying it to something as beautiful as producing life.
Yeah.
It seems wrong.
Reproductive. It's not reproductive rights. It's the opposite, if anything. Because I mean, we're talking about abortion here, right?
Of course.
It's anti-reproduction. So, well, you know.
So let's have a quick look at some of the data. I've taken some screenshots. This is some of the methodology. This is the Likert scale stuff. I forgot that I had that, but yes, I've already explained that. So we can move on to the UK data. Here we are. Sorry if you have to squint to see it, but here's the UK. Share of people with at least one bias. In women, it's 27%. Men, it's 32%. So those are
rookie numbers.
There's only about a 5% difference between men and women in the UK.
Yeah.
So is that really a problem at all? I would say, well, maybe that 5% is just like an experiential gap.
Maybe. Yeah.
In that women have experienced the world a bit more. Also, they're probably more prone to be feminists, and therefore.
Well, I was going to say we have to wonder how much of that is as a result of feminism.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think there are still differences in countries that haven't been penetrated by it. Like we're looking at, it looked at places like Pakistan, and there's still a slight increase in the male one over the female, but there's a lot of similarity between the two. But if you could scroll towards the right, John, so we can see some of the individual. So here we have the political ones, like 19.4 and 22.36. So they're basically the same. Which is probably why they have couched it as men and women's attitudes towards women. Yeah. Like women can be sexist against themselves. So they've done that to try and reflect the data, but then also the way that they've presented it suggests that it's men's fault somehow. That we're telling women what to think when in reality, quite often, other women help reinforce each other's attitudes in the same way that other men do the same thing for each other, right?
Yeah, but this has the same kind of flavour as, you know, when you see Americans typically talking about how, like, there are people of colour, to use the vernacular, who are like racist towards themselves by being conservatives, right?
The blackface of white supremacy being at Larry Elder, which was ridiculous.
Exactly,
that's the LA Times, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think this comes out of this kind of Rousseauian impulse, the idea of, you know, forcing someone to be free. You know, they're
You'll be free or else.
Yeah, they're going to tell you that, no, you're being sexist towards yourself and that needs to stop. Or you're being racist towards yourself and that needs to stop. Whereas actually, you know, maybe these people haven't just been duped. Maybe there are reasons for them holding these opinions.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's one of the main points I'm trying to make here is that, it's more complicated than you're presenting it, UN. So let's have a look at the United States, shall we? So here they are. They're clearly more biased than the UK, apparently. I mean, I'm not necessarily surprised based on the dimensions, of course. The reproductive rights thing is splitting the country, so that's kind of an unfair criteria to judge America by, because men and women, you know, are probably on equal parts or roughly equal parts on either side there, because it's red versus blue. And so it's unsurprising given that the general consensus in Britain on abortion seems to be permissive of it.
There's no dialogue around it, you know, in the mainstream at all.
You almost seem like you're being a bit left afield and bringing it up a lot of the time. So if you can scroll to the right, John, a little bit, so we can have a look at some of the other dimensions. So the economic ones, there's quite a difference there, but also educational, they're pretty similar, right? Only 3% difference. Political, there's about 5% there.
Yeah.
So it's not too unheard of. Now let's go to somewhere a bit less Western, Ethiopia. Okay. Here they have 98.73% of women have biases against women.
Yep.
Kind of suggests that it's a bad metric if nearly all of the women have biases against women.
Yeah. They must just have internalised misogyny.
Look at how close it is in a more traditional society, a developing society, in economically developing, of course. 98.73 for women, 98.81 for men. That's, 0.0.
Yeah, nothing.
What? Yeah, it's so small. And why do you think that is? It is probably because. Sorry, you were about to say something. Weren't you?
I think it must come down to the fact that somewhere like this, we could even think of it in terms of they're almost closer to the natural condition by being.
That's pretty much what I was going to say. Is that
in being an economically developing nation with. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was just going to say that in the West we have somewhat of an economic abundance, though we can afford to have these luxury beliefs.
Yes.
That, you know, men and women are exactly the same. There are no differences, which isn't really true, is it?
That's nonsense.
And so these sorts of things kind of illustrate that actually, well, basically 100% of them at least have one bias, right?
Yeah.
They're very comparable levels. And so it suggests that developing countries that don't have the ability to...
The capacity.
They don't have the ability to avoid the gender roles, even if they wanted to, which they don't, because you know they understand the value in them, that women look after the family, men provide.
Yes.
That's the only way their society can operate. And so it makes sense that their attitudes are like that.
Yeah.
And it's actually a form of cultural imperialism by the UN. I sound like Putin or something.
Yeah.
But to try and impose Western attitudes on places where they don't belong.
Yeah.
And it's silly. And so I'm going to quickly go over some other data so we can have a look at Sweden, the supposed egalitarian utopia. 27.91% of people have a bias. And yeah, it's less. Most of the countries with a reduced bias here, by their own metrics, are European, North American.
Yeah.
They're sort of in the Anglosphere. And
but again, places far removed from, again, what we might call the state of nature.
So let's have a look at the communist utopia of Venezuela. Oh, look, people with at least one bias, 92.35%. Much, much higher than the horrible capitalist imperialist West.
But you wonder where that comes from, because you tend to find in South American countries that they in terms of their social values, they are very, very conservative. Like communist Cuba was probably more socially conservative than current day United States, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive. But I don't think that. I mean, I think there's probably an amount of, Venezuela is not a good place to live. So, again, they are pushed, they don't have the capacity to have these luxury beliefs about men and women. But also there is this, the underlying social conservatism there that still remains to this day.
And then finally, let's have a look at Japan. And they're sort of along Western lines, but not quite to the same extent. And I just thought that was interesting because they're an example of a country that's remained quite conservative, quite traditional, but also they've, they're of a comparable economic scale, if not perhaps more developed than some European countries.
Yeah.
And so it kind of suggests that there is a social dimension to it as well, in that, well, it's not entirely economic development. There's some social aspect as well.
Definitely.
So there are things you can tease out even from this poorly gathered data, conclusions that you can make. Obviously, it's only an interpretation of the data. But I think it's also worth mentioning as well that countries that are most likely to take action on this report tend to be the ones that have the least so-called biases. Yeah. And so it is going to eventually end up aggravating situations in the West, whilst not really being acknowledged in the countries that they would probably term as needing it the most.
Yeah. Well, those countries just love flagellating themselves. Our countries rather love flagellating ourselves, don't we? So.
And of course, it's also worth mentioning as well that a lot of social attitudes are shaped by women. Let's point out the fact that ISIS, their cultural enforcers were women. Obviously, the men were fighting, so there's a certain practical dimension to it as well. Yeah. But I think it's a good sort of analogy. Obviously, it's not quite as militant. I mean, you had Shamima Begum pictured holding an AK-47. Yeah. I don't think our women do that so much.
No, I don't think so.
But no, I think our mothers and our grandmothers tend to shape our social attitudes more than men. I think, and just talking from my own experiences here, my father and my grandfathers tended to focus on encouraging me to develop practical skills or physical ability, knowledge, and kind of toughening me up a bit. It's not so much those other things. Yeah. But in sum, together, they make something really good, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond that as well, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but where I live right now, it's a village, and the neighborhood I live in is very sleepy, very quiet, populated by probably 20% uni students, and the rest is just pensioners, basically. And there's this one particular lady who she's always out in her garden, so I speak to her most days, and she is, she's the don, right, of the neighborhood. She is the boss. And everyone kind of, everyone knows her. Everyone knows who she is. And she's always the one, I mean, she puts people's bins out, cuts people's lawns and this sort of thing. She is this kind of bulwark of order in my little neighborhood. And I think that role, that kind of, the older woman who maintains the local culture and traditions, that's a tale, certainly in England, that is a tale as old as time.
I was actually talking to Daisy, our social media manager, earlier. And she had a phrase that I thought was quite nice, that women are like the managers of the household in a way.
Yeah.
In that they're managers of a different sort, but
Yes.
they keep order, they keep things running smoothly. And that's really important.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know about you, but you should be working to live a good life outside of what you do. Your
course,
job
yeah.
doesn't define who you are.
No, absolutely.
And so you should be, at least I do, living for your family in a certain sense.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I think that's actually a very rewarding thing. And by demeaning it, you're not helping anyone. You're helping fracture families, basically, which is already a massive problem.
Absolutely.
And one final, somewhat facetious point I want to make is that for every dollar a man earns, his wife spends 77 cents.
Is that so?
That's obviously not an actual fact. That's playing off of the gender wage gap thing in America. But my point is that the reason that most men do anything is for the benefit of either their family or their potential family in the future.
Yeah.
And so the reason that men go for high-paying jobs is so they can treat their family well, raise their children well. That's why we have this impulse to do these things. And
not to get too soppy and personal, but I have a girlfriend of nearly 4 years, and I'm crazy about her, and everything I do is kind of in service of building a family with her. Right? I love doing
that's the right thing to do, though.
Yeah,
right? And it's very wholesome to hear.
Yeah,
as well.
and that's not to say that I'm incredibly passionate about politics and the commentary and doing this sort of stuff, but actually all of it is in service to that one prime goal that is support her, protect her, and build a family with her one day.
That's exactly the right thing to do, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel the same, although I'm between girlfriends at the minute.
Oh,
I've said that on the internet now, so I am going to be.
You're going to be inundated.
Please, no. But it's also worth mentioning as well that if you go back in the past to the so-called sexist times, you look at things like World War One, men dying in the trenches in the mud in Passchendaele, in the Somme. Were they really privileged? They were fighting on behalf of protecting their women and children at home, weren't they? Is that really a male privilege? Is that really... I mean, when the Titanic was sinking, who was it who had priority on the life rafts? It was the women and children.
Always the case. And it's not the women and children making that decision either. It's the men saying women and children first. And if you are a man who cuts in front, you're scum. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
It's part of being a man to acknowledge that,
Yes.
To a certain extent, we are a bit more disposable.
Well, I was going to say, there is actually something to the argument that men are actually kind of more expendable than women.
Yeah.
I mean, even like just on a biological level, right? One man can impregnate however many women. One woman can only hold one baby, and that's for 9 months, right? So in terms of the rate of, reproduction, it's important to have women around, right?
There's an acknowledgement that in sort of paleoanthropology, that one of the theories, obviously we can't prove this, but one of the theories as to why Neanderthals died out, are sort of cousins, and Homo sapiens survived, is that we had defined gender roles, and they didn't seem to have as defined gender roles, as in more female Neanderthals were found with wounds associated with hunting, which of course puts the baby at risk and potentially affects the rate of reproduction.
Yeah.
So there's some food for thought there. But
Indeed.
I wanted to end on a bit of a positive note because, quite often when we're talking about these things, the tendency is to be resentful. And actually, I think it's nice to acknowledge that we serve an equal role in building a good society.
Yeah.
So I think men and women are good and bad at differing things, and we complement one another. We co-evolve together.
Yeah.
And so we work well as a team, right?
Yeah.
We mitigate each other's shortfalls, and there are lots of things that women are good at, and I'm going to talk about men as well, but they tend to have high levels of empathy and emotional intelligence. That means they connect better with people, means they're better in caring roles like nurses and social care, which are essential for the function of our societies, right? They score higher on average verbal fluency and reading comprehension. They tend to be better at working as part of a team. They tend to have greater appreciation of the value of family at all.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, for men, you can talk about the 3 Ps of masculinity: protect, provide, and procreate.
Yeah.
And protect is the most exclusive to men because we have 30% higher physical strength, particularly in the upper body. Provide is self-evident, right?
Yeah.
And procreate also means, raising the kids as well.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a whole thing that complements one another. And also, of course, men are less risk averse, so do almost all of the dangerous jobs. And so that means that women are protected to have children.
Yeah.
And that's good for our society. I think that the differences are a benefit to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really do think, again, not to sound too sort of soppy and sentimental, but I really do think that if the feminine and the masculine are allowed to express themselves, if you as a man cultivate masculinity or you as a woman cultivate femininity, it shines through as this kind of, and there's something divine about it, I think, something really irreducible and kind of magical about it. And I mean, there's no recognition of that by people like the United Nations, who view it all in terms of statistics and spreadsheets. But actually, again, the masculine and the feminine are complementary and sacred and beautiful.
I think the problem here in the West is we've got two kind of, I don't want to say bigoted because it's a spoilt word, but two sides of the same coin. You've got kind of the feminists and the incels. Both make generalizations about all men based on their selected experiences.
Yes.
And normally when I hear people generalizing about all women or all men, I think, oh, you must be a low status person because you've associated with bad people that have burned you.
Yeah.
Maybe you're right in saying they're bad people. Normally people have a good nose for that. But the fact that that's your experience says more about you than it does about society.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Thanks for watching that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed that and want to find more, you can subscribe to the website for as little as £5 per month to get access to all of the premium videos we have on offer, including Beau's Epoch series, now at 110 episodes, the latest one where they're talking about the Anglo-Dutch wars with Carl. And if you want to keep up to date with what Beau is doing, you can follow him at Twitter, at HistoryBro1. Thank you and goodbye.